waffles. That's the single greatest. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful food. That's the best pork chop I've ever had. But that chicken waffle dish with the Newski's maple syrup is unbelievable. So the other night, Rick was at a generator event. Mike, you were there too. And we've been talking about asking George Mosher to be a part of the podcast now for a while, and Rick just asked him and he accepted, right? I find George to be this incredible force, individual force in Milwaukee. You know, in a place that catches a lot of heat for the lack of early stage investment, the lack of innovation and entrepreneurship and so forth. I know that 3 years ago when he was in the Investors Hall of Fame, he had made 160 plus investments. And I'm wondering, like, since then, how's the scorecard look now? So I want to ask him about that.
He sells his company 10 years ago. You know, everyone else started there going and seeking warm weather somewhere. You know, what really is it within him that says this is why I want to help this community, this early stage community?
You know, he's clearly an intelligent guy, and as Mike said, sold his company 10 years ago, and he started out driving an ice cream truck.
I mean, it's a function of, to me, you know, grew up in Boston, worked his way through Harvard and Harvard Business School. How did he even get to Milwaukee? So we're here on the GrowthMinded Podcast, joined by George Mosher. George, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Okay, you're welcome, Todd.
So you grew up in Boston and then graduated from Harvard and then Harvard Business School.
That's right.
That's 1963, and then in 1965 you moved to Milwaukee.
That's correct.
To run a furniture company. How did that happen? What brought you to Milwaukee?
Well, I had been active as a sort of a small-style entrepreneur while I was going to school. My first father died in the war, and he died in a German prisoner of war camp from starvation. And shortly thereafter, my mother got remarried. They married really for economic reasons. They fell in love after they got married. And my second father, liked to take sandwiches to work. And I basically didn't like sandwiches. I liked hot food. So I thought if I'm going to eat well, I need to have some of my own money. So that acted as a strong entrepreneurial drive. And I was encouraged early on to work. I worked as a caddy in golf for a year or two, and then I worked in an amusement park for a year. And then I drove an ice cream truck for 3 years. And in the final year of driving the ice cream truck, which was owned by Harvard student agencies, I was able to earn $2,000 at a time when tuition at Harvard was $1,650. So that got me interested in making money and having my own money, and now I could do things that I otherwise couldn't have afforded. Mm-hmm. And I also got active at the Harvard Yearbook selling advertising, and at Harvard Business School, I was asked to be advertising manager of the Harvest, and for the first time, they put it on a profitable basis as opposed to just being supported by the student agency. And in the first issue that came out, I went away for the summer. I hired some people to sell advertising for it, and the first issue was 16 pages. And I had a headmate, which means we shared the same bathroom, at Harvard Business School. His name was Dick Resch, and he had come originally from Minneapolis and wanted to get back to the Midwest. And so he gave me a call and he said, George, how would you like to take over a mail order catalog company in Milwaukee? And my image of Milwaukee was somewhere between Newark and Bridgeport. But I was ready. I was working for Look magazine and caught a little bit up in the bureaucracy. And so I decided I would take that job. So we came out here, and that was 1965. And the company had been in business for 3 years and had never had a profitable month. And I realized that the sales of $250,000 were not enough. And I figured out that we could mail more catalogs, and we got the sales up to about $750,000 in the first year.
In the first year.
So, and it was profitable, marginally profitable, but profitable, which was a big change from before. Mm-hmm. And then at that point, things went sort of gradually from 1965 to 1972. And then all of a sudden, things started to click. Catalogs became more mainstream. We were selling mainly folding chairs, folding tables, stacking chairs to churches and schools. And all of a sudden, we figured out how to do it. And in 3 years, we took the business from $2 million to $8 million. Now, when you talk about 1975 money, you can sort of multiply everything by 5 or more. So that was a dramatic growth. And then we opened offices in Atlanta and Los Angeles, which meant that it was much easier to sell nationally. So all of these were working very nicely. And the people involved decided that I was going to start to make too much money. I had a contract that said I would earn 10% of the profits. And they thought that was going to be too much money. So they were trying to rejigger the contract.
Okay. So that's the impetus behind National Business Furniture.
Right.
That you and your wife started in 1975?
1975. They knew that I was a compromiser, but my wife has got a strong inner strength also. And there was no way that she was going to compromise. So in 20 minutes, I walked into the Heritage Bank, and I had the money from Roger Dirksen based on the value of my house. Mm-hmm. And it was a great benefit of inflation because the house had gone in value from $30,000 to $100,000. So I was able to borrow $50,000 to start the company. And in 7 weeks, we had our own catalog, and we changed the catalog from an emphasis on church and school furniture to an emphasis on office furniture. Mm-hmm. And so we were not directly competitive with the previous company. Mm-hmm. But right from the beginning, we got very strong results, and we never really had a losing period.
And before you sold it 30 years later, you grew that to $130 million. Can we talk a little bit about $130 million in revenue? Can we talk a little bit about the growth? Was it pretty steady, or were there significant growth stages?
Well, first of all, it took us about 3 years to get to $3 million in revenue. And thereafter, it doubled every 5 years, which is a growth rate of 15%. And there were some ups and downs with the economy, but on the whole, it was pretty steady. As I look back on it, it went from 3 to 6 to 12 to 24 to 48. And it was at a time when your employees also expected a 15% growth, so they didn't feel the company was growing fast enough. So there was both internal and pressure from myself and external pressure from employees to grow and provide opportunities for growth.
Mm-hmm. You've certainly shared some wisdom over the last decade or so within the early stage community. Which of those lessons are drawn primarily from National Business Furniture?
Well, National Business Furniture, I focused on keeping it simple. Every 4 months, we would formally sit down and list all of the different ways we could grow, and then evaluate which of those seemed to make sense. And what we gradually found is there was always some small ideas you could do this or that. And I tended, when we went through the formal process of saying how could we grow, by listing the pros and cons of each, it became clear that a lot of the small ideas would yield small results. There were 3 ways that we had found we could grow: more pages, more catalogs. But we were also very efficient. One of the most important courses I had in business school was a course on production. And I realized that running an office can be treated like running a factory, but you can't call it a factory. But every process needs to be standardized. And so we were able to, or my goal was to get $1 million in sales per employee, which we ultimately achieved. But we ran the whole company with a payroll cost of 4%, including my own. And the net effect is that our competition could not keep up with us.
Interesting. One of the quotes I read from you online on an alumni site for HBS had to do with understanding what your strengths and weaknesses are and surround yourself with people to deal with the weaknesses and focus on your strengths. And can you talk a little bit about what brings that quote to life for you?
Well, first of all, my partner was my wife. She had opposite strengths than I have. I'm an optimist. She tended to be a pessimist. The truth is somewhere in between. She has a right brain, a creative brain. I have a left brain, a numerical brain. Males tend to view the word shopping means something different between men and women. Women buy everything like a man buys a car. Is this me? They'll browse, but when they find the right item, they will buy it if they can afford it. Where men regard shopping as comparing A versus B, and has this got more woofers and tweeters, and am I getting a good deal, etc. So by bringing the feminine touch to the catalog, office furniture is a feminine purchase if people are doing it themselves. It's more masculine if you have an architect involved because they're laying out 25,000 square feet. But we built the catalog on the theme of beautiful offices at affordable prices, and she had a way of designing the catalog so it made it look like this is furniture you'd feel comfortable having in your office. And that was very instrumental. Other areas that I was strong on were analysis. I'm very good at analyzing numbers, which was very important to direct mail. As the computer came along and IT became more important, we needed to hire for that. One of our acquisitions, the early acquisition, was a company called Alfax in New York that had spent a lot of money getting a computer system, which we did not have. And by buying the company, we were able to get their computer system, which worked perfectly for National Business Furniture. So by using other people, I was able to overcome my lack of understanding of IT.
Interesting. Recently, you and your wife, Julie, received a Lifetime Achievement Award from Biz Times. And 2013, you were the second person inducted into the Wisconsin Investors Hall of Fame. You've done a lot in the 10 years or so since you've sold the company. Can we spend a little time on that?
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful that I've been able to maintain my energy level. I just had my 77th birthday, and I learned how to get a good night's sleep. I was having problems doing that for a while. Once that got solved, I've got energy. My wife had a lung transplant 8 years ago, which meant that she doesn't have as much energy. What she does is she can do it well and enjoy it, but she needs to take a break. Mm-hmm. So it's actually worked out well that I'm still going to an office, doing things like this. I meet interesting people. I stay alert. And so that all of that has worked out very well.
You and I don't know each other all that well, both involved with Golden Angels, but clearly you're involved at a level that maybe nobody else is in the state in terms of early stage as an individual investor. I read an article doing the background on having this conversation. You were into more than 150 companies at that point. Tell me if I get the numbers incorrect, but at the time you were quoted as saying, I've had 35 losses, 17 wins, and 100 open investments. So 152 investments in 7 years.
Well, it's now up to 243. And I've had about 30 wins and about 70 losses. So the proportions are staying the same. And there's another 140 that are in various stages of life, some of which are very marginally alive and some of which are thriving and will be successful.
Mm-hmm. It seems that as involved as you are, you can't help but continue to learn every day too. Is that part of the passion that drives you every day to be so involved in so many different?
Well, I will share a little story that I don't tell very often. I was in New York and I got involved in a weekly poker game, and I had been winning a little bit, and then I started to lose a little bit. So I decided that I would needed to know more about poker. So I went out and bought 4 books on how to play poker. And in 7 weeks, this was a game where people were winning $30 and losing 20, more losers than winners. And all of a sudden, in 7 weeks, I'd won $250. So that showed me the value of an education. If you focus in on a subject, you can learn a lot. At that point, the phone rang and someone said, how would you like to move to Milwaukee? So the game would not have been able to take somebody winning that consistently. So I've been a big believer. What I learned at Harvard Business School, I've been able to use for the next 50 years. And the basic principles don't change. The tools keep changing, but the principles don't change. And I like keeping up with things. I'm curious, and I enjoy everybody's story, and I enjoy working with people.
Your strategy of, what is the number now?
43.
243 investments over a 10-year period of time, with 91 of them in the last few years. Is that a sprinkle the board strategy? Is that I want to be involved in as much as I can?
Well, if we go back to the beginning, the impetus for this is I had done some angel investing while I was still running National Business Furniture. Mm-hmm. And on the whole, it had been interesting and reasonably successful. So when it came time to sell the company, I wasn't ready to retire yet. And part of it was substitution for philanthropy. I said to myself, I've got some money, I've got some skills. There are young people out there that have ideas and energy and talent. And if I can help them, what they don't have is money. And if I can help them get started, they can build a business. And actually, the business mailers had a big effect on me, because pretty much all those companies, once they got up and started, grew kind of together. So you didn't really see many failures. Some of the things that I've been learning is all of our children, and by our, I mean the top 10% of the income stream, have had everything that they needed and most of what they wanted. And they did not grow up like people in my age with the concept of limited resources. And what I'm seeing is too many young people starting out, spending all their effort trying to raise money as opposed to finding customers. So I'm now saying I really am limiting my investments to companies that have gotten at least $200,000 revenue. It's not a lot of revenue, but at least they found some customers, people who can use the product beyond their brother-in-law. Right. And so getting over that hump has been much more challenging. But I think it comes from the concept of people not having had to think enough about resources. We live in right now, for example, the world is saying we're going to pay for everything and we're going to tax the rich. And, well, how much can they afford? Well, they can afford everything, whether it's free college or whatever it is. The rich are going to pay for it without quantifying it. In the old days, people were much more comfortable saying, okay, if we raise taxes this much, we'll have this much money. When I started the company, I figured out I could do it with $50,000, and I never had to raise another penny. My wife and I were able to own the company completely because it was a bank loan. Mm-hmm. And so
with a personal guarantee on it against your house.
Or against the house, right. Yeah. So what we were risking is maybe having to move into an apartment. I knew I could get another job somewhere.
Sure. Okay. I want to go back to your comment about a form of philanthropy. This is my perspective, and I'd actually value your insight on it. I think in Milwaukee in particular, there's a fair amount of emphasis paid to the Fortune 1000s and the top 7 or 8 companies in the state or in the area. And then significant energy spent on early stage innovation and new companies and so forth. But I actually look at you as an example of somebody who built a company over a period of around 30 years, had optimized the operation, maximized the exit opportunity, and then took some of that capital and plugged it back into that early stage community. And I see hundreds of medium-sized companies that might be stuck at 10 or plateauing at 25 and looking for ways to grow. And I just don't see a lot of emphasis paid there to help those companies maximize their exit.
Well, the Greater Milwaukee Committee is trying to do something in that area with scale up, but that tends to be even the smaller companies. I think what I'm seeing with the mid-sized companies is when their children come aboard, either things get much better or they lose it completely. So it's an up or down. One of the speeches I've never forgotten is Mitt Romney 35 years ago talking about Bain Capital. And what he would find is that a company would reach a certain point, the owner would be 60 or 65, ready to sell. Everybody knew what the company needed to do next, but it was typically a bet the company situation. So if you had all of your net worth tied up in a company and there's an 80% chance of success, you still don't want to do it. So they were able to buy companies and, in a sense, make that investment. And sure enough, 20% went under, but 80% prospered, and many of those prospered to the level of 10 times what it had been worth before. And I was able to invest in a Bain fund, so I was able to see how that had worked.
Seems to be there's a great amount of awareness around over the last 6 to 12 months. Every month or so, there's another article about how the Milwaukee startup community is struggling, and the national survey results were just above Pittsburgh, but second last in the country in terms of innovation. What is your take on that?
My take is there's a cultural difference between really the fact that I grew up in Boston was relevant to having some sense of entrepreneurial activity. It wasn't my family, but my best friend's family was the head of a major advertising agency. And in visiting with him, I would overhear conversations about various entrepreneurial activities. It was definitely part of the Boston culture. Interestingly, the Boston culture was based on academia, and it was sort of cheating to be working as a team originally. The California culture was based on teamwork, and as the computer got so complicated, it took 5 people to sit around and figure out how are we going to make this thing work. And in Milwaukee, there was a sense of safety. If you have money in Milwaukee, if you own a company in Milwaukee, and it's successful, you have a good income, you have status, you have a certain amount of freedom. Life really can't get any better than that. If you sell it for money, you have more money, but what are you really going to do? But in California, you don't have the status if you own a $10 or $20 million company. You're still second tier. You're not. It's almost like a movie star. Do you get invited to the A parties or do you get invited to the B parties? So if you sell your company and you have a successful exit, then you now, well, first of all, you can afford the house you really want to live in, because a simple house in a good area is a 7-figure purchase. And in Milwaukee, you can live on what you can earn comfortably. So there's, whether you're earning $30,000 or $300,000, within your friendship structure, you can live comfortably.
To that point, the cultural aspect of things. You're obviously extremely familiar with Generator. I've seen you at a few events there, and they've done some good things in terms of national recognition, especially number 15 accelerator. I suppose in California, the granddaddy of them all is Y Combinator. And culturally, they have a term called spirit of helpfulness, right? Which I think speaks to what you were just talking about. Do you think that exists in southeastern Wisconsin?
Well, it definitely exists. The problem has been there have not been enough payouts. In California, there are a lot of people that have made money on their investments. What's really driven this economy has been software. Wisconsin has gotten more involved in medical. In medical, we're running up against the limits as to what we can afford as a country. It's now 18%. So the government doesn't announce it, but it's consciously slowing a lot of this down, because it's far better for your wife to be sick with something that there's no known cure than something that you can't afford to buy. So the government is starting to face this indirectly, and they very slow approvals on new medicines, new drugs, new medical devices. Where in software, there has been, the iPhone when it came out didn't have to be perfect. People, cell phones in particular, people were so happy with them that they were willing to accept imperfect products. And then the product got better, but the people who adopted it first were just happy that they could make phone calls from their car, and they'd put up with the drop signals and other kinds of problems. And I had once read that when you're looking for innovation, you turn to the private enterprise. When you're looking for protection, you turn to the government. So Wisconsin has gotten wedded to the whole medical industry. And you have companies like TomoTherapy that looked like they were going to be very successful, and then it collapsed. So people do not have the profits to reinvest in other startup companies.
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of companies that collapse in Silicon Valley and other places like Austin or Boston and so forth, where they seem to be a little bit more accepting of those failures too. Do you think that's part of it as well?
I think that's part of it, but I think people who have sold companies people are always looking for profitable opportunities. So if there were more successes, the generative program, for example, I invested in the fund, which gave me an investment in 15 companies over a year and a half. And there have not been any true successes out of that yet. The first generator, Eat Street, is going to be a true success. Mm-hmm. And the final thing we're running into is that companies that are successful early are being sold at multiples of sales, but ultimately when they get to be profitable, they sell for multiples of EBITDA. There's actually a fairly steep negative slope between a company being worth 5 times sales and 7 times EBITDA. And nobody has been talking about what happens during that period. And what you get into is you get cram downs where the company starts to get valued on a different basis. And people who invested early and were reasonably successful on it aren't seeing the payouts. They're going to the next part of the chain.
Interesting. I lived that example.
Okay.
I worked for a software company in town called PKware, invented the zip file, and we grew it from $1.5 million to 28 and sold it for 7 times EBITDA. So as you mentioned, 7 times EBITDA, that sticks in my head.
And I've benefited from a couple of these. One of my companies was a healthcare revolution, which was software for the iCode industry. And at $8 million sales, it was able to sell for 4 times revenue. Mm-hmm. But ultimately that value, it'll probably still be worth more than that, but it'll have to grow to where it really has substantial EBITDA before it's worth that after the growth curve settles down.
Outside of Eat Street, I suppose people are starting to point to bright sellers as companies that are on the right track, but with a ways to go. Are there other early stage investments over the last few years that you're particularly excited about?
Well, the one early winner I had, my biggest winner, was a company called Prodesse. Prodesse was managed by Tom Shannon, who had accounting training, and they grew over 6 years to about $4 million in sales. Then they got the answer to determine on a global basis information about swine flu. And all of a sudden they were able to go from $4 million to $18 million. And then they were able to sell it for $85 million. But Tom was an accountant. He wasn't in love with the product. So when the time came to sell, he was able to make the decision to sell. A lot of the new companies are started by somebody. Orion is a good example. The person who started Orion, which built up to $100 million in sales and then went public, really was doing it because he believed in energy savings. He had invented a process where using the same wattage, you would double the light in a warehouse. It grew rapidly, but he was like an evangelist in talking to him. Ultimately, he was doing it not to make money, but to help the world. Mm-hmm. And as he made money, they would find ways of spending it. And I'm seeing a lot of other people who are more interested in developing the product, or they develop a successful small business, then they put all of their money into developing something new. And when that doesn't work, they've lost it all. There's a great book that I read that talked about World War II. And when people say things take a long time, we won World War II in 3.5 years. And we really did it at minimum cost in both money and lives by going flat out. Well, one of the problems, they brought Charlie Wilson in, who was head of General Motors, and Roosevelt hired him the day after the Germans dropped over the Maginot Line. So that was really 5 years. And they offered him $1 a year to build the army. And one thing led to another, he was solving a lot of the problems. But aircraft, every time a plane was shot down, somebody would want to modify it because they didn't want to lose another life. Well, they were not getting production volume out of it. So ultimately, he ordered them to build a factory in Wichita and then build an adjacent factory. And the first factory built what they had standardized on. Then the second factory would make the adjustments to what was now the new norm. So they were able to grind out airplanes. And without that, we wouldn't have been able to win. And if they kept making the changes, it would have been a job shop rather than a production line. So that, to me, has been a big lesson. When you have scope creep, get the job done, and then go on to a whole new version of it with all the changes. And I think Apple has done probably the best job. They don't keep changing it every week. They do the changes they make don't require that you buy the new product, at least for a while. And they've done that better than most people.
I think in an article, you said something along the lines of, it's really fun to talk about all the successes that have occurred, but it's the losses where the lessons are, right? For the entrepreneur, for the investor, and so forth. Are there a couple of lessons that you've learned, maybe even the hard way, in investments that you made in early stage?
Well, I think the most important thing is to see whether the person themselves has a drive for profitability, growth and profitability. Is this a plan or is it a dream? And a lot of angel investments come through with a projection with 50% growth per year, maybe even higher. And in year 3 or 4, it's going to turn from being negative to highly profitable. And sometimes 70% of the sales are going to go to bottom lines. Well, nobody runs a company where 70% of the sales go to the bottom line. So a lot of people have a dream, and have they been able to flesh it out into being a plan? And as somebody said, even the worst plan lets you know where you thought you were going to go. So if you're not achieving it, at least you can see what assumptions you were making are not correct. As an old saying that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And so the real question is, generally the other thing that I'm looking at today, which I didn't look at enough, is someone got an idea for what they think is a market, or is there really a market? The third thing I'm seeing is, it's probably best exemplified by a company called Fish-A-Day, which published the books Fishing Hotspots. And they always charge for that. I mean, you went to a store and you spent $5.95 or $7.95 and you got a map of a lake and this is where the fish are, and that was worth something to people. Somehow on the internet, as they came out with a system, they thought it should be free. And then they have a premium plan of which 3 or 4% jump up to the premium plan and pay $50 or $100, $50 a year or $9.95 a month. But they haven't really asked, if this thing is worth anything, why wouldn't you pay for it? And the best example to me is Twitter. People who are on Twitter are really addicted to Twitter. Certainly if I'm a Twitter person, I would pay $10 a year to be on Twitter. There are a lot of people who aren't really on Twitter. They would drop out. But $10 a year times anything is a lot of money. Mm-hmm. 0 times anything is $0. And trying to make it on advertising, you're looking at your phone quickly. You're not looking at advertising. I've just read a book called Chaos Monkey, which I'm not highly recommending it, but it's of interest. But the sense of how do you make money? Google started out making money. Steve Jobs always asked, how much can I charge for it? And ultimately, he did what the phone company did originally. Originally, the phone company, if you'd had to pay the full cost of the wiring on your phone, it would not have become universal. By, in effect, giving a 9% dividend, they got everybody with money to buy AT&T stock. That financed the whole system. Apple got out and they charged $200 to the customer and $500 to the Sprints and AT&T of the world. They added another $15 a month to your plan, right. And that's how it all got financed. If you'd had to pay $700 for it, it would not have. I mean, a lot of people would have, but a lot of people wouldn't. Mm-hmm. What I'm also learning is the wisdom of the crowd is better than my wisdom. My most successful investments have been made through Silicon Pastures, and there's been a sense of ideas bubble through a lot of people who can find something wrong with it. And the ones that most people agree on seem to be strong enough to be much more successful. The Golden Angels is moving in this direction. But if you really look at the history of the Golden Angels, it takes a long time for things to be successful or disappointments on the way. And by focusing in on how do we make a company successful, what will it take, that's where the successes come from. Yeah. I'm starting to get interested in the whole concept of whether everyone should go to college, and we need more emphasis on how do you, if you work with your hands. I'm getting involved with an organization called Build to Learn, which construction workers are making $50,000. Many people leave school, but they have no skill that's going to have a major effect on them if they get concentrated and learn. My father actually taught for Career Academy after he retired. He was teaching designing and drafting, and he would get kids that really didn't know what they were going to do with their life. He happened to be an outstanding teacher, so he was able to take them, give them the skills that were necessary to get a job, and once they got the job with the right motivation, then they would keep it or they would build their skills. You're seeing a lot of that, I think, with the computer today. Kids who would formerly have been fixing their cars, it's almost impossible to do today, but they understand the computers, they get into the computers, and they can make the computer sing. The best advice I heard was at a eulogy from one of my relatives, and his son was saying, "Dad, I've been admitted to Marquette. You went to Marquette. What subject should I study?" His father thought, said, "Well, let's see. For the first 10 years, you're going to need to do something that shows you can get something done. So maybe you'd like to take courses on accounting. The next 10 years, you're probably going to be managing some people, and you'd be helpful if you'd had courses in psychology. In the third 10 years, you'll probably have made some money, and you're going to need to know how to manage it. So you probably would like some courses in finance. In the fourth 10 years, you've been wondering, what is this all about? What have I been doing this for? What's the purpose of all this? And you would have wished you'd had courses in philosophy. In the fifth 10 years, you're starting to say, what's my future? Where do I go from here? And you would wish that you'd had courses in theology. And that's the best advice I could give someone going to college. It lays out a path. If you basically stay at something, you get to be good at it. And I think there's been too much emphasis on everybody should go to college. If you show up for work every day, one of the things that we found at National Business Furniture is you hire a typical, ordinary, reasonably well-motivated person. If they stay with you for 10, 20, 30 years, they become fantastic at the job that they're doing. They get to be experts at that, and that's what you want. And whether it's a file clerk or whether it's a customer service representative or a telephone salesperson, they just become great at the job. And we need more respect that any job is worth doing if someone's willing to pay for it. But it's important for you to make sure that you show up every day and some days you'll feel better than others, but do your best every day and you will be far more valuable then the people, I'm not sure whether I should be here or not. And so I'm starting to pay attention to how you get people to get satisfied and want to do the things they really feel like doing. I think one of the things that's never talked about is that the average person, really what they want is to be part of a successful team. They don't necessarily want to run things, but it's why we root for the Brewers and the Packers. Even though none of the Packers live in Wisconsin, this is our team, and the amount of loyalty and enthusiasm they were able to build is strong. One of the concepts we got in business school was the concept of the group norm. And you can influence a group norm. You can have a group norm where everyone comes to work and spends half an hour over coffee just getting started. You can have a group norm where people don't care that much. The Maslow triangle of what people really want is the feeling of doing a good job and being recognized for that. We were strong proponents of the Maslow triangle. What'll happen is that people, if that doesn't happen, will drop to social, and I'm sure you're seeing in a lot of companies today where people are spending significant time on Facebook because the company is not is not engaging them in the way that it could. For a while, when the Japanese companies were strong, they were really embracing, you're working for a company and we're working for this together. So we were able to get that as part of the group norm. One of the most important things that we did is we really emphasized keeping or hiring carefully, expecting the person to be successful, and then working with them to make sure that they stayed with us. So we really celebrated the 5-year anniversaries, 10-year anniversaries, 20-year anniversaries. We had an employee hand show pictures of employees, which was important because we were scattered over several cities, in which everyone's picture, but we would emphasize this is a 5-year employee or a 10-year employee. And after someone worked for us for about 3 years, they had to pass tests and they had to go through several hoops to get it, but they would become a senior customer service representative. And then ultimately they would get a significant share of their income from profits. Our salaries were always more than competitive, but they could earn another 50% of their salary. What surprises me now is how many people seem to be bogged down and not knowing where to go. It's almost on a personal level, people expect somewhere out there there's a perfect mate for them. Instead of finding someone that they get along well with and work together with and build a relationship, they expect that somehow there's going to be this magic spark. A career, those who are successful sort of being ready for it. If an opportunity comes that makes sense for them, go for it. And I think this sense of where do I go? It used to be that you could fly over Chicago and say there's 20,000 policemen and 10,000 firemen, and everyone, you had an identifiable job. Now, if you look down to somebody's in charge of graphic design for something, it's almost impossible to describe what many people's job is. And then they go to work and they're not sure what they're supposed to be doing. That's what comes through in Chaos Monkey. They go to work for Facebook and it's not so clear what they're really trying to do. But those who are successful figure out what will make a difference, and they can build their careers in that.
Another quote of your own talked about getting older and in retirement, wanting to stay involved and staying active and so forth. Can you just talk about what you see over the next few years for yourself in terms of level of involvement?
Well, first of all, I have to face the fact that a lot of it depends upon what my energy level is. When I sold the company, I knew that my number one responsibility was my wife and making sure that she was taken care of and everything was going okay. This has resulted in she needs warm weather. So we go to Florida and California for January, February, March. So I made up my mind I wasn't going to be totally invested in something that I had to be there. I find that I always have lunch with somebody interesting every day. And so I build my schedule around lunch. And what I do is just I've got a very good balance in my life right now. It's between the family. Our kids live in New Zealand. They come over here twice a year for 2 to 3 weeks each time. That all my grandchildren are in New Zealand. My son lives in Chicago. He was just up over the Labor Day weekend with his friends. My daughter lives in Santa Monica, so we spend a month out there. So we've got a good balance with our family. The business is going well. One of the things that I said is take 75% of your money and have it professionally managed. Take 25% for your dream. So I set a budget. My wife was a warrior. One of our personal stories is that if I went to Las Vegas and I was $7 behind, she was very unhappy. I had read a book on how to make money in Las Vegas, or True Magazine, and I had filled notebooks with calculations, spinning a roulette wheel. But I needed a little bit of stake, so I said to her, we were going in January, I said, she asked, what did I want for Christmas? I said, I'd like $500 in a rubber band. So that was the stake. She'd already given that to me. As long as I was within that stake, she didn't really have to worry. So then I could work on the system and make money in Las Vegas. So not big money, but just. So
how'd you do?
Well, I typically would make money. Basically, if you...
Roulette are the worst odds in Vegas.
Well, what it really boils down, ultimately moved to blackjack, but basically, if you take something, blackjack is not a true randomness like craps or roulette. Mm-hmm. But if you gradually escalate your bets and then quit when you're ahead, you will win. A good example is in blackjack, if you put $15 down, and you lose it, then put another $15 down and you win it. Well, you increase the bet to $25 the second time. If you win it, you've lost 15. You've won once, you've lost once, but you're $10 ahead. Mm-hmm. Typically, if you win the $15, they'll give you a 25 and a 5. Most people would leave the 25 and pocket the 5. Now they lose that. They've won once, they've lost once, they're down $10. So most people go to Las Vegas when they've lost the amount that they had planned to lose. If they get ahead, they're playing on the house's money and they're having a good time. Yeah.
It takes discipline to be able to turn.
So you have to know where. Right. So basically, if you were willing to lose 500 and you win 250, then that's the time to go home. So you'll feel like a winner.
George, thank you so much for taking all this time.
Thank you, Todd.
I appreciate it.